The longtime television producer of 60 Minutes, I didn't know about this guy until I read about this guy, but Don Hewitt, he was apparently pretty famous as producers go. He recounted the experience of countless associate producers coming to him to pitch a segment for the show, for 60 Minutes. They came into his office with lists of interesting details about the latest political fiasco or financial crisis or the infidelities of the latest celebrity. And then he would say, stop. 4 words. Tell me a story. That's what he would tell his associate producers. They would come with juicy details, and he said, stop, tell me a story. Hewitt's associate producers were not all wrong. To tell anything at all, you need points, right? You need a series of important moments to describe anything. Even if you're describing a recipe to someone, you need a plot, in other words, events of the story that you want to tell. So the reason Don Hewitt made 60 Minutes famous was, though, in part because he knew that the news wasn't just a listing of facts, it was telling a story. And the way you sequence events together in succession isn't important for only fictional stories. He knew this. It applies to 60 Minutes, to the news, right? So true stories, that's what they were telling, or they were trying to tell anyway. He was a storyteller of real events in the past. And with 60 Minutes, usually it's the recent past. But what is a storyteller of real events in the past? What are they called commonly? A historian. Okay, news is a kind of history making. So the first rule of historians, according to Old Testament theologian John Sailhamer, is the principle of selectivity. That's what we talked about a little bit already. It's not possible, Sailhamer says, or desirable to record every event from the past. As the Apostle John said in his gospel in John chapter 21, and there are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written in detail, I suppose that even the world itself would not contain the books which were written. So John, the gospel writer, he selected certain things to tell the history, and he didn't select other things. And so Sailhamer says the historian, and I might say a nonfiction storyteller, the historian, must select what events to include and exclude. And this has to happen. You literally can't say everything. Even if you try to say everything, you can't do it. But Hewitt knew that a mere list of facts, even a list of the juiciest and most provocative details you can imagine, details alone, if they're not connected, if they're disconnected from each other, they're not intentionally tied together, and that's what a story is, then the details will not persuade. Sailhamer continues, the second component of any good historian, or else any good storyteller of reality, the second component is the work of arranging the events of history into the shape of a story. A historical story, like any story, must carry its reader along the most meaningful path to its conclusion. So I'm going to get to my point here. It's not all about story. But hear this again from John chapter 20, at the end of John's gospel. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples. And so you can hear the reason why he includes 7 signs is on purpose. He did many other signs, but he selected some and he deselected some, which are not written in this book, John says, but these are written so that you may believe. Here's the purpose. Here's the arc of the story. This is the aim, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. So let me just say, by way of aside here, this isn't just for story nerds or history nerds. if you're a science nerd, this applies to science as well. So science, if it isn't connected to a story, is just a list of facts. And you can ask Mark Rober, or you can ask your kids who Mark Rober is. The reason why he's so brilliant and the reason why he's so popular on YouTube is partly because he's a great scientist, but actually it's mostly because he's a great storyteller. He's a great storyteller. He invites you into the story. There have been decades of studies that show how unhealthy the American diet is, but it doesn't matter what all the studies say until a Netflix documentary picks a couple of them and makes a big deal about it. Then everyone doesn't believe the story, right? And then we have evangelists of maybe partially true stories, right? Okay, so stories are persuasive. Stories are persuasive even when it comes to science. God knows this. TV and documentary producers know this, that we are story people. That's how we're persuaded. And the book of Chronicles is no different. The book of Chronicles was written probably around the 5th century BC. So this is 2 or 3 generations, most scholars think, after the Babylonian exile. So this is very late in the history of the Old Testament, in the history of God's people. Our reading is one of, if not the last Old Testament books, and it's the last book. If you're reading your Hebrew Bible, it's the last book of the Hebrew Bible. So Chronicles is not grouped with the historical books like the Septuagint did and the way our English Bibles. It's not in the middle, it's at the very end. It's at the very end. And I think this is important. It's not the most important thing about Chronicles, but it is important. For hundreds of years, the stories of the prophets, or else the law, we talked about the story of the law last week. We could continue that story, the law and then the prophets. The story of the law and the prophets for hundreds of years was told, and then the story was not told. It was lost. And then it was recovered for a little bit, and then it was lost again. This is what the chronicler details. And at the end, Chronicles was written to retell the story of God's people to returned exiles from Babylon. And the writer of Chronicles is not just sort of recapping everything in sort of boom, 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 everything is exactly the same. He is pulling the reader along a specific path. He wants to show a purpose in the story for returned exiles. Specific events were selected, others were not selected. Songs were added into the telling of the story to make it more vibrant. New details shed light on the old story, so there's little side stories. Lovers of the Silmarillion rejoice, right? This is kind of how the chronicler is telling the story. Like a master storyteller, all of this was tied together for a purpose. What is that purpose? Like a documentary filmmaker, Chronicles is written to persuade. That's what I think he's doing. The chronicler is doing this. So our Old Testament reading at the very end of the Hebrew Bible is the conclusion of this final retelling. It's the very last bit. It's the very end of this retelling of not only Israel's story, but the story from the very beginning. Chronicles begins from the very beginning of the law, Genesis chapter 1. So what is the story? What is the story? Well, I'm going to tell it pretty quickly according to the chronicler, but Chronicles begins with Adam. The very first word, 1 Chronicles chapter 1, verse 1, the first word of the story is Adam. It's Adam, and the 9 chapters of genealogy at the beginning of Chronicles are like a table of contents for all the key characters in the story. So he's intending to tell the true story of the people of God, not from the birth of the nation, like the prophets do, but from the birth of humanity from the very beginning. He's telling a comprehensive story. And immediately after the 9 chapters of genealogy, and I would love to spend multiple weeks on the 9 chapters of genealogy, but we're not going to do that. We're done with the first 9 chapters. Immediately, it goes to the story of Saul. And Saul's story in Chronicles is very short. It's very short. It's 1 chapter. because, and this word comes up over and over again in the chronicler's retelling, because Saul was unfaithful. He says it once. He was unfaithful. Saul broke faith with the Lord, and he dies. That's the retelling of Saul right there. Like that's it. This is where the story begins, according to the chronicler. King Saul is dead. Fast forward to King David. So this is how the chronicler tells the history. Like your favorite superhero team-up movie, so you can be Marvel or DC or something else that I'm not aware of, King David assembles his mighty men from all Israel, from the united nation, the whole nation of Israel, and they immediately go and defeat all the bad guys. This is how the rest of First Chronicles unfolds. That's the whole first half of this book. With all of his mighty men, King David kills everyone. And there's some of the greatest writing in the history of stories in First Chronicles. A lot of it's borrowed from Kings, but it's beautiful, okay? So it's beautiful. They kill everyone, and the chronicler makes specific mention of David taking all of their stuff. It's even more so than the original telling. King David defeats all of these foreign armies, and he takes their stuff. Why? He brings back all of the spoils of war. He gathers all of the priests together in Jerusalem to worship God, and then David sets out to build the temple. The temple. He sets out to build the temple, or else, in the language of Chronicles, the house of the Lord. The house of Yahweh. This is the central thread. This is the central thread of Chronicles looking back on the entire Bible. It all points to this high point, the house of the Lord. All Israel gathered together to worship God in the house of God, and then the unexpected happens. The hero of the story, it doesn't end up being David. God tells David that he cannot build the house. Not that he won't. He tells him not to. He tells him not to. The entire story of David's life is conquest in the power of God so that he can build the temple, the house for God, to unite all Israel together to worship God in this place. That's it. That's like David's whole thing. That's what he exists to do. And God says, you will not build the temple. I will build my own house, and I will establish your son on the throne forever. And so this is how the end of First Chronicles comes to a completion. So like Moses, David dies never having seen the promise fulfilled. He didn't fulfill it. This is the first part of the story. Every victory in battle, every sacrifice, every organizational plan points forward to this house, and David doesn't build it. Have you ever been there? You thought, man, I got a really big plan. I'm going to do something great for God, and then it just doesn't work. It doesn't work. God says no. Second Chronicles begins. All Israel is finally united as one nation, but not warring anymore. The mighty men are no longer mighty in battle, but they're mighty in worship in the house of the Lord with, and this is another big theme, all the assembly. And this is the same language for church. Okay? All the assembly, over and over again, they're gathered together, the assembly. So David's son Solomon is on the throne, and he sings to God, unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. It's the high point. It's the high point of the history of the world to this point, according to the chronicler. All the hopes of Israel are embodied in Solomon, David's son. He builds the house of God according to the plan, with all of the stuff that David, his father, gathered and collected for this purpose. He executes the plan. The earthly palace for the heavenly king is blessed. All the heads of the tribes, all the priests, all the congregation, all Israel on their knees in prayer, all the Levitical singers with a loud voice singing songs of ascent, like we said this morning, Psalm 122, as they go up, as they ascend to the house of the Lord, in order that all the peoples of the earth, and again, not just the nation of Israel, but from Adam and from Abraham, every person throughout the earth, may come to the King of heaven and know and love and fear the Lord. And so the Queen of Sheba, people from far off come. They come to Solomon. It's a picture of what God is doing. Come into my presence. Come into my house. This is the high point of the story. But, like Saul, the kings are unfaithful. They store up their treasure on earth, in earthly kings, in the temple, in the moment. They put their hope in their loud songs of praise and their fervent prayers. The son of David, Solomon, dies, like every son of David after him. With him, all hope is lost. The people no longer gather to worship, and the kingdom immediately splits. It immediately splits north and south. The north is now called Israel, and the south is called Judah. It's a divided kingdom. The house that David built, that he passed to his son to build up the house for God, splits in the next generation. This is how the chronicler tells the story. And most of David's sons, the kings, did evil in the sight of the Lord. They were unfaithful. And the chronicler reminds them, go up to the house of the Lord. You need to go up to the house of the Lord over and over again. And even the few good kings after David and Solomon, like Hezekiah or else Josiah, in the end, they all fail. 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 5, just before our reading, each king did what was evil. Verse 8, he did abominations. Verse 9, he did what was evil. Verse 12, he did what was evil. He did not humble himself. Verse 13, he stiffened his neck and hardened his heart against turning. This is the summary of the story of the kings at the end of this retelling. Verse 14 from our reading, 2 Chronicles chapter 36, in the first part of verse 14. All the officers of the priests and the people likewise were exceedingly unfaithful, following all the abominations of the nations. So from Adam to all Israel, from king to the bottom, they were all the people, including the clergy, likewise were unfaithful. It wasn't just the kings who were unfaithful. It was all the people, including the priests, maybe especially the priests. They were not only unfaithful, like Saul at the beginning of the story, they were, and the language here in verse 14 is they were unfaithful. And it's not just that he repeats the word, he actually adds an adjective in front of that. They were exceedingly unfaithful. So if you didn't get the point, if you thought Saul was the bad guy and the rest of them were the good guys, no, actually, they were all exceedingly unfaithful. Verse 14, they polluted the house of the Lord that he had made holy in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent persistently them by his messengers because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they kept mocking the messengers of God, despising his words and scoffing at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord rose against his people, until there was no remedy. There was no healing, is another way you could translate that. No healing left for God's Son. So God sent his Son to Babylon. He sent his Son to Babylon. The people wanted the abominations of the nations, so God gave them what they wanted. Gave them exactly what they wanted. Therefore, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts, the Apostle Paul says, to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. So God said, "You want that? I'll give it to you. I'll give it to you." God's son, Israel, was restless because he slept in the bed of a Babylonian prostitute, and there was no healing for him anymore. There was no remedy except to give his son up to Babylon, to let him sleep in the bed of his own making. But the story is better. It's a good story, because even this was ultimately for their healing. Jeremiah chapter 23. Twice messengers are mentioned in Chronicles 36. and 3 times Jeremiah is mentioned. Here, Jeremiah, the prophet of the Babylonian exile, hear what he says. After this, after all these judgments, I will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have driven them. I let them go. I let them follow after their own loves. They went to go to Babylon. I'm letting them go to where I have driven them, Jeremiah says, and I will bring them back to their fold, and they shall be fruitful and multiply. You hear Adam. You hear the promise given to Adam. I will set shepherds over them who will care for them, and this is kingly language. And they shall fear no more, nor be dismayed, neither shall any be missing, declares the Lord. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up for David a righteous branch, a son who will build the house. And he shall reign as king and deal wisely, and shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In his days Judah will be saved, and Israel will dwell securely, the house of the Lord. And this is the name by which he will be called. The Lord is our righteousness. This is what the Messianic king will be called. So Jeremiah, the prophet of Josiah's restoration, watched as the kings and the kingdom after Josiah crumbled completely to the ground. The house fell, and he wept. He's the weeping prophet, but he did not grieve like one who has no hope. For he says, the days are coming. The days are coming. The king will return. We will dwell securely in the house of the Lord again. 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 20, the king of the Chaldeans took into exile in Babylon those who had escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and to his sons until when? Until the establishment of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days that it lay desolate, it kept Sabbath to fulfill 70 years. Now, there's a lot going on there. I'm not going to unpack it all. Let me just tell you what I think that means. God's Son was always restless. They were always restless in the land. They never really settled. This never settled down. So the Father, the Good Shepherd, he was going to make his Son lie down in green pastures. This is the language of Psalm 23. In the judgment of exile in Babylon, the land finally rested. This is the language. The land itself, as they were taken out of the land itself finally rested. The land. So according to Chronicles, 50 generations after Adam, it's a very orderly account, the son of Adam, God's son Israel, would finally rest. After 50 generations of man, and the language of Cyrus, which we're about to see, is a Jubilee proclamation from Leviticus. And that happens twice every century, every 50 years. So 50 years after Adam, after 50 generations of man in the 50th year, or else the year of Jubilee. And Peter Leithart calls the year of Jubilee the Great Super Sabbath year. The Great Super Sabbath year. I think that's the best way to describe it. In that year, in the judgment of exile, in that place, God's Son rested. They were out of the land, and finally, the land rested, and they were able to rest. Like Adam in the garden, even in the moment of judgment because of his unfaithfulness, there was hope. There was light breaking in. There was promised rest. Where does the hope come from, according to Chronicles? Hear the last 2 verses of the Hebrew Bible. Verse 22 of 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Now in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah might be fulfilled, the Lord stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, king of Persia, so that he made a proclamation throughout all his kingdom and also put it in writing. Thus says Cyrus, king of Persia, the Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever is among you of all his people, may the Lord his God be with him. Let him go up. So you hear this. Return from exile. You hear the house of the Lord. You hear all the kingdoms of the earth united under a king going up into the house of the Lord. This is the end of the Hebrew Bible. David didn't build God's house. Solomon built the house and gathered the church to worship in the house, but that house was destroyed. It was only pointing to the true home. And now this, and this is the surprise ending of the entire Old Testament, a Gentile Persian king delivers God's Son to go up into the house of the Lord. Don't you know that God uses unbelievers to accomplish his purpose? God shows mercy to his exceedingly unfaithful Son with the proclamation of a pagan king. Judgment leads to rest, even in exile. Delivered out of exile to go up to rebuild the house of Shalom in the city of Shalom in the year of Jubilee. This is how the Old Testament ends. The final messianic word of the Hebrew Bible is spoken by a Gentile king. I will build the house. Come, let us go up. This is the last word of the Old Testament. God shows mercy through a Gentile king, but like all the kings in Israel, he was unfaithful. He wasn't the hope. He wouldn't build the house. The New Testament begins with another exceedingly unfaithful Gentile king ruling over Jerusalem. There's a rebuilt temple even. And God's Son, Jesus, the King, comes out of Egypt, but he is finally faithful. The long-awaited son of King David, Jesus sets his face towards God's house in Jerusalem from the beginning of his life. And along the way, he proclaims the year of Jubilee, the year of the Lord's favor. Like Hezekiah and Josiah, he sets a table in the presence of his enemies, a Passover feast. He multiplies bread for 5,000 hungry people, and he does this over and over again. We only get a small selection. And then he tells them that they must feast upon the bread of heaven, his body, and they scatter. The house of God, John says, is his body. The temple of his body will be torn down, and in 3 days it will be rebuilt. This is the fulfillment of all the longing, of the thread that the chronicler is hoping for at the end of the Old Testament. This is the hope that the house will be rebuilt. And John says it's Jesus. Jesus is the temple. His body is the temple. So in his resurrection, Sabbath rest finally comes. Jubilee is finally here. Jesus is the telos of the story. He's the end. According to the chronicler, according to the law, it doesn't really matter how you tell the story. He is the point. It's all leading to him. He is the faithful Son. This is why we order our life. Everything. All of our rhythms of telling and retelling the story, we orient it around him. In just a few weeks, we will retell the story of our faithful King as he ascends to his throne. The Messianic King, Jesus, takes his throne on a cross. The bread of heaven is broken for us. The house of God is torn down and rebuilt in 3 days. This is what we're looking forward to. The great 50 days of Easter. Think of the Chronicles. I don't think it's meaningless. 50 generations from Adam to this messianic hope. We celebrate our resurrected and ascended King seated at the right hand of the Father in glory. This is the story that we're telling. This is what we're invited into. This is the hope of the chronicler, and it's the hope of the gospel writer John, and it's our hope this morning. Jubilee in Christ, a home in his body, Sabbath rest, finally a resting place, peace in him. God has shown us the exceedingly unfaithful compassion in Christ. So with the psalmist, with David in this psalm of ascents, I invite us this morning to let us go up into the house of the Lord. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.